Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ACTV. I'm Jenny Davidson, your host today. I am the CEO and Executive Director at Stand Up Placer. We are a victim service agency serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking here in Placer County. We have a 55-bed safe house where people can go to escape their violent situation for up to 90 days while we work on a permanent housing plan. We have a housing program where people can live for 12 to 24 months. And we have a service office in Roseville, a service office in Auburn where people can get access to legal services, therapy, crisis intervention, any kind of emergency needs you may have. So if any part during the show you think that maybe you know someone or maybe it's happening in your life and you need some help, you can call our 24-hour crisis line at 1-800-575-5352, and there will be somebody there ready to take your call. And that line is staffed by a person who's there at work waiting for your call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So please do call us if you have any questions or if you need to be connected with some services. So I'm really excited today to have two very special guests in the studio to talk with us about social justice issues and the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking with all of those social justice issues. So welcome, ladies. And they both work at Stand Up Placer, and I would love for you to just each give maybe just a brief introduction of yourselves and what you do for Stand Up Placer, and maybe just a little bit about why are you passionate about social justice and about the survivors who you serve every day.
Okay. Hi, my name is Isi Yoha. I'm one of the sexual assault outreach and services specialists, and I'm based in our Roseville office. The reason why I'm so passionate about social justice is because social justice is basically a philosophy that everyone should be equal and everyone should have equal opportunity, like regardless of like how you were born, where you were born. And so I really believe that, and I feel like social justice is really just like saying I care about other people and I want everyone to have the same opportunities. So that's why I'm really passionate, just because I really care about other people.
And I am Michelle Peters. I'm a safe house crisis counselor. So I answer the crisis line if you need help. I'll be there usually about 20% of the time. I'm there to answer the phone. I also work with clients that are going through our 90-day safe house program to escape human trafficking, domestic violence, or sexual assault. My passion towards us, right now I'm studying psychology and women's studies at Sacramento State. Psychology started me into this industry just due to surviving my own issues myself, as well as having familial issues with psychological disorders. After working with Stand Up Placer, I developed a really feminist attitude and social justice attitude, because you see it so often every day with the clients that we work with and how it plays out within domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. That everybody deserves dignity, everybody deserves peace, respect, and a life free from abuse.
Awesome. So we're going to use some words that maybe the folks at home don't use every day. We use them all the time at work, but we can't assume that everybody really comes from the same background or uses the same words. So how would you define feminism, social justice, the words that we're going to be using today, and how do those things relate to domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking? And I know we're going to go in a lot deeper. So
yeah, so I think feminism can be a scary word for a lot of people. There are extremists in every type of group we have within our world, and what feminism really is about is just equality based on gender and sex. And we're just making it possible that women are treated as equally as men. So there are different movements that happened within our country specifically. For instance, the right to women's suffrage, the right for a woman to vote, started with the first movement of feminism. And then we get into second wave feminism, which was during the 1950s, when we have a lot of white women standing up to staying at home, wanting to get into the workplace, getting equal pay. And now we have our feminism today, which is a third wave feminism, more related to intersection, meaning that we take into account social justice, not just gender gender, but racial issues and ability issues, for instance, mental disability, also sexuality injustice. LGBTQ survivors are also survivors of violence. So these are the issues that we really come across in the work that we do. And feminism is just another word for equality.
Yeah, I really agree. When I think about feminism and social justice, I think about like structural inequalities. So understanding that when we talk about sexism or racism and we talk about just abuse in general, there are things that are part of our history and it makes a part of our history. That's why we still will see it to this day. And then when I go into feminist spaces and social justice spaces, it's us addressing those inequalities and wanting basically to put an end to them.
So what has like the social justice movement done? Like it started, you're talking about some things happened in the 50s, but it started, it's sort of been going along on some level forever, but really stepped up its game about 100 years ago. Can one of you just talk about like that social justice movement and how it's affected maybe laws, politics, different things in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're considering just laws within the past 100 years, because we could spend a whole show on just the entirety of it. But, within the 1920s, we are seeing domestic violence really becoming illegal. It was legal to beat your wife at that time. Women were seen as property. Marriage was an institution, and it still is in some ways, to be property of a man. So women couldn't take out credit cards, women couldn't open their own banks. And then we have slavery and a lot of other issues that contribute to racial injustice and access to people of color getting resources to get out of these violent situations. So all of these movements come into play. All the laws have changed access to resources. For instance, our company did not start until 1978 as a rape crisis line. So that started with funding. It starts with your votes. It starts with being educated when you're voting and really standing up to sticking to the laws. It's not about political party. It's just about ending violence.
And you brought up funding. The Violence Against Women Act first started in the mid-90s. And so it's really kind of crazy when you think about how recent, like my youngest son was already born before there was even a federal funding stream to help agencies like ours. So the Violence Against Women Act, I think was like 94-ish, and a lot of that came out of as a result of the O.J. Simpson stuff that happened and people finally seeing that this was a really major issue. And every year or frequently it comes up for reauthorization. And so it's one of our major issues is just like how we use our votes and how we use just the political climate that's happening right now. What would you recommend to people? I think people on both sides of a kind of polarized community that we live in around politics are feeling a lot of frustration and anger, and they don't really maybe even know what to do next. And so what are some things that people who are paying attention to that, or maybe they haven't been, maybe they should be, what are the laws?
I think that it's, when it comes to politics, a lot of people sometimes don't like to talk about politics because it can get really heated. I mean, you can get into a debate about almost anything these days, but I think what's really important is when we're talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, it's just important to understand, like, these things are wrong. They shouldn't be happening in our society at all. So as Michelle was saying, it doesn't necessarily matter, like, what party you're a part of or not a part of. I think a lot of us can agree that these things shouldn't happen. So what can we do to make sure it's not happening? Like, be educated, like, learn more about politics, and also not just on like who's president, like all of that, but also on a local level. Like writing to our local senators or local representatives, telling them what is important to us, so that like things like the Violence Against Women Act like doesn't get dismantled, and then all the funding that goes to crisis centers is like gone, you know? So yeah, educating yourselves, like talking to our local representatives, I think is a really big thing. And like they're accessible. You know, I've called our representatives before. I sent out emails and they like talked to me. They emailed me back. So it seems intimidating, but it's not.
Right, absolutely. And even reaching out to your local community organizations like us. You can call me on the crisis line and ask me any question about our organization. If you are considering, where are my tax dollars going? Why would I use this for this movement at all, or why do I want to pay for this? Call and ask and see how your money is being used. I mean, you are a citizen, or a tax-paying citizen. You have the right to do that, and I absolutely am free to answer any questions. I know that the money that we're using within the company is going for the right reasons, and it's not for personal gain. It's to help people get out of these violent situations, and definitely reaching out, educating yourself, reaching out to the government and all the agencies.
Yeah, and we're pretty friendly, so we like to talk about these things. Yeah, so don't be afraid to like call us or drop into a service office and be like, oh, I'm not really sure about this. Like, can you tell me more? Like, I'm always happy to talk about it. So
yeah. And so, although our agency just serves Placer County, why is it important to look at a global perspective when it comes to feminism or the other social justice issues that we've talked about?
I think it's extremely important when we talk about specifically in regards to human trafficking. When we are using the term human trafficking, a lot of the times it is women and men within the United States. But we don't talk about how 15,000 to 18,000 of those people are actually immigrants and smuggled into the U.S. and trafficked within our country. And when it comes to a lot of talk of immigration rights, and that's not necessarily if you are a survivor that is a non-citizen, we don't discriminate. We're not going to discriminate against status. You have access to every single resource that a citizen has through our company. Yeah. And that's very important, because the fear of documentation, the fear of being held in or deported is huge for these survivors, especially when their trafficker uses it against them. Yeah. So when we take on a global perspective, we say that this is not happening just within the United States. It's happening all over, and it's happening in and out of our country. People are being moved in and out, and we have to think of that when we are serving immigrants and non-citizens.
Yeah, and it's also really important to understand that an injustice somewhere is an injustice everywhere. So if something is happening like across the world from me, and I see that people are being like put down and abused, even though it may not be happening in my neighborhood, to me it's still a big issue, because it shouldn't be happening anywhere. So I think that's why it's also important to take like a global perspective, because if it happens somewhere in this world, then it shouldn't be happening at all.
Right. How can an intersectional feminist perspective be used as a tool for survivors to cope with their abuse and find empowered perspective?
So first I want to kind of dissect that question. So when we say the word intersectional, that is when I first explained feminism, this is like a third wave feminist movement. We are saying that our identities are not only singular. Yeah. For instance, I am a woman and a daughter and a survivor, and I'm not a woman at 9 a.m. and a survivor at 10 a.m. I'm those things all the time. So if we don't take into consideration all of these experiences and how they work together to form and to navigate our lives for survivors, then we aren't able to really serve the issue as a whole. We're only taking one piece and treating one piece and then saying, well, the rest doesn't matter. But it does, because they work together. And that's what really intersectional feminism is about. It's saying that it's not just about gender, it's not just about race, it's not just about one thing. It's about all of these things and how they work together to privilege or to disadvantage each individual.
And what does it mean to apply that then to the work that you both do with survivors?
I think that it's really important because I think that knowledge is power. So then when survivors come in and I tell them, like, these are basically the powers at be, and then it's really relieving for them to know, like, oh, this abuse wasn't my fault, or oh, what I went through wasn't my fault, because here are all of these things that also affect how I am. And then for them to understand, okay, I was born into these things, like I was born into a woman and that is like a risk factor for abuse, or like I was born black, white, whatever. Understanding that, yes, I was born that way and I can't help that, but I can help like how I react to these things. I can help how I move about this world. So I think that having that education and that knowledge is really empowering.
So now I'm going to throw in another big vocabulary word for the day that we use all the time at work, but trauma-informed. And so when you bring it, so explain a little bit about what it means to be a trauma-informed agency, and then how that plays into the other topics you were just talking about.
So when we talk about a trauma-informed approach or trauma-informed care, it's basically just understanding that trauma affects people on like a emotional, physical, psychological level. So trauma basically affects everything. So when we talk about trauma, being trauma-informed is really understanding that the trauma is affecting like every part of this person's life, and it's like affecting like how they navigate the world. And then when we talk about like intersectional feminism and we talk about inequalities, it's also important to understand that inequality also affects people on a psychological, emotional, and physical level. So to bring those two together is really how we can like help survivors, and is how survivors can also help themselves, is understanding that there may be these things that are against me, but there are a lot of things that I can do to like help myself and help me get out of this situation.
Yeah, trauma-informed is it's a great way that we can serve our survivors. And honestly, you can use it in your daily life. If you it's really just about understanding people. It's understanding their experiences and how our experiences shape our lives and shape our future decisions. So if I am traumatized in some way, that is going to affect the choice that I make in the next 10 minutes. It's going to affect every choice that I make, even in terms of what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight. And that's something that is such a core effect on survivors that we need to understand how that trauma interacts in order to help women and men navigate through their lives after they've experienced this violence.
And so if you look at that like on a just actual, like where the rubber meets the road, somebody comes into one of your services, the Roseville Service Office or the Safe House, and they've experienced trauma, and they've experienced some kind of marginalizing or just the different kind of risk factors that they walk in with. How do you take that into perspective? How do you step up to serve that person that day?
That's a great question.
I feel like think about this. Oh wait, you go first and I'll.
I think that if somebody is, for instance, so not necessarily on a drop-in basis for what I am doing, because I'm doing Safe House, I'm working in the emergency shelter, that if a survivor is coming to me from a background and maybe they don't have food to eat that night. These are things to be informed of, because in order to get through your trauma, you have to meet all these other needs first. I have to meet needs of safety. I have to meet needs of food, of water, of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to consider all these needs first, and that's really what it is to be informed. And I think that's how I respond to people. Firstly, number one, it's always safety. And then if there's questions of food, water, clothing, we can treat all of those needs as they come. So being a survivor and being low financial status should not prevent anyone from seeking services. We are here to help. We're not here to judge. We're not here to place blame. That's the biggest thing. You're not at fault for the situation you're in.
And so one thing you brought up, though, is the socioeconomic class. And how does that affect maybe a survivor's their experience in domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, their ability to escape, how they might consider their possibilities of getting out of it?
Well, I think first, I think a lot of people, there's like a myth that, oh, domestic violence happens more in like poor communities, when that's not true. Domestic violence happens everywhere within all classes, like it touches everything. So, but I think that with someone who's like a lower social economic status is it affects like access, like it affects like how can I get to things. So for example, if someone is leaving a violent situation, whether it's domestic violence or they're getting out of like human trafficking, like the life or something like that, then if they have like no money, like their partner controlled the finances, so they have no money, like maybe I have a family, like how am I going to like get a job tomorrow? How am I going to have a house for my family? Where am I going to get something to eat? Because oftentimes people leave like literally with the clothes on their backs. So for someone of a lower socioeconomic status, that's something to think about. And then something like that also will make someone stay longer. So if they're like, oh, well, maybe I don't have a job because my partner didn't allow me to get a job, or I don't have credit, so I like can't buy a car right now, then it will cause them to stay in the relationship longer. But with that, I do want to say there are resources like Stand Up Placer. We give emergency food, emergency clothing. We have our own transitional housing program. So even if the resources look like they may not be there, they really are. They're right here.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's important that we understand that funding is limited in these, and that's why we need to keep voting and educating ourselves on the politics of violence and how we prevent it and how we treat it. So, for instance, if we are talking about socioeconomic status for a survivor in the safe house, and our housing program runs out of funding, that is going to be a very difficult barrier for a survivor to face, and a barrier that may push a survivor back into their violent cycles, into going back to the relationship. And we have to understand what else, we're all trying to survive. We're all trying to get through our day to pay our bills. And when we add violence on top of it, it creates a whole different story. And so we need to keep this access to safe houses, to emergency houses, to food and clothing, or else how can I really escape if I don't have anything to eat or wear or a place to sleep?
And just economically, it saves the community money to invest in something like Stand Up Placer to have those safe resources, instead of the amount of medical care, law enforcement, all that kind of stuff where they're having to continuously respond to violent situations, and that those are the most violent situations that law enforcement does have to intercede in. And so just having them have a safe place to go makes a huge difference for a lot of different agencies. That we had a study a few years ago, the average cost of one felony incident of domestic violence or sexual assault in Placer County, and it was $500,000, and that's just one incident. And so just making sure to support the different organizations that serve in your community, it's very, very important. And then EC, how do racial disparities affect intimate partner violence?
Well, I could talk about this for like 10 hours. I'm gonna consolidate it. So I think that a huge way that racial disparities affect all of these things is, first of all, like, am I going to seek help or am I not going to seek help? So for like people of color, Black and brown people, when like someone wants to come out and say, I've been abused and I need help, it can be really hard because you're not just thinking about yourself. You're thinking about how is this going to affect my community? How is this going to affect like how my community looks? How is this going to affect how I'm going to be seen within my own community? So people of color have to think about all of these different things on top of, okay, now I also need help. So I think that's definitely something to take into account when we talk about racial disparities and how that affects all of these things. So I have, in the center or where I work, it's more like people can come in and just drop in and like talk to me. And some folks sometimes will say, okay, well, how is this going to make me look? Like, let's say they come from a community that stereotype is more dangerous. How is this going to make my community look? when I seek help, or if I have to like turn this person into law enforcement. And then I always tell them, like, no matter what you do, everyone deserves to live a life of peace. Everyone deserves to live a life without violence. So there are a lot of these things that you were taking into account, but at the end of the day, like, you deserve to like not just survive in this world, but to thrive in this world. So like everyone needs to get the help that they need.
Awesome. And how do stereotypes, so the stereotypes that go along with that, whether it's from racial disparities or gender or ableism or class, how do those affect a person's ability to access services, or just like the culture around people believing like, oh, well, you know, that's how it is in that group, or...
Well, stereotypes are interesting because I think that they exist on almost a biological, well, they do. Research shows that they exist on a biological level within all of us. So it's a term called implicit bias, where our neurology is set up throughout our lives to after being educated and watching media every day, we develop, and within our communities there are stereotypes of gender, of race, and we are programmed to think this way. Whether or not we consider ourselves this way or not, we do on a biological level. And we have to acknowledge that in order to serve survivors better. So like EC was saying about how it would reflect, for instance, some communities are stereotyped as dangerous, as criminals. That's going to create fear for that survivor to come out to police. Maybe they have issues or trauma involving law enforcement themselves. So we just need to consider these stereotypes and how they play into culture.
So I have one last question for you, and I think we only have a couple minutes. So how do we as a society, with the goal to end domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, continue to make progress for survivors and social justice?
Oh, there's a lot we can do. Some things can just be like educating ourselves. So educating ourselves on policy, also educating ourselves on what does domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking look like? What are red flags? So if you see a friend in that situation, then you know better on how to help them. And then when you educate yourself, you can also work on preventing these things in the first place. And I think that when people see activism where they think about these things, they're like, do I have to be a protester on the front lines, like picketing? And you don't have to be if that's not the type of person that you are. There's like a lot of little things you can do. Like if you hear someone saying like a racist joke or a sexist joke, then you can just stand up and say, hey, I don't agree with that, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. And then when I really do believe that when one person stands up, then like it really gives everyone else around you confidence to do the same thing. So it's like a really good domino effect.
That's awesome.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, people can volunteer, they can seek resources themselves. Having conversations like this, you know, over coffee or over a dinner, educating our children is a huge, huge way to prevent these things. Awesome. And reaching out to your community services like Stand Up Placer.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for coming today and being brave and coming in and talking. And thank you to everyone out there who's tuning in today to ACTV and watching it live at home or on YouTube. I really appreciate it, and just keep up the good fight and keep up the work that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.